I'm Dr. Ian Kane, and I'm here to moderate this discussion this evening about emergency management and non-governmental organizations. The local community found out about NGOs and disasters and emergency management rather rapidly during Waldo Canyon, during Black Forest, and then again during the floods that took place in Manitou. As a result of that, it was an interesting experience to look at what went on in terms of integrating our community and working with emergency management. I can note that there are some emergency managers and some people with extraordinary experience in the audience tonight. If you get a chance to talk to them, their perceptions are pretty good also in terms of what they can bring to bear to indicate their interest. Universities have been very interested in emergency management and Homeland Security for quite some time in terms of looking at the policy, bringing to bear the concepts, and of course everyone knows that there's a great center at the University of Colorado in Boulder that's involved in that. And also the School of Public Administration is doing that also. So I'd like to recognize the Dean of the School of Public Administration, Dr. George Reed, who's in the back of the room. Dr. George Reed, thank you very much for sponsoring this evening. We appreciate it.
Thanks for being here.
I got the opportunity to be involved as a volunteer in that activity quite some time ago in planning and also in the response to those emergencies, and also doing some exercises, and I hold a doctorate in that particular arena. But it's not about me this evening, it's about the panelists that are here, because these are extraordinary experts in this field, and they're very current because they're acting in that. So I'm going to ask them if they would, starting on my left, to introduce themselves and give you a little idea about what they do.
Hello everyone, my name is Doug Rouse. I'm volunteer manager of Catholic Charities of Central Colorado. I'm also the current chairperson of the South Central region of the BOAD, Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster. So South Central region is a 5-county area. We go from Chaffee and Lake and El Paso and Park and Teller in the city of Colorado Springs. I've worked for Catholic Charities since 2011. My exposure to the BOAD movement was with Waldo Canyon. I helped coordinate the volunteers that served the meals at one of the shelters, and our agency also participated in Black Forest Fire, feeding first responders, and we also do small things like there was a hailstorm where essentially a block was affected, and we did case management to help some of those folks that needed help with their roofs and such. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Before I get into my, can you hear me back? Just before I get into my pedigree and who I am, I want to echo something Dr. Kane said. Universities are getting interested in emergency management. Well, just yesterday, possibly a Category 5, an EF5 tornado struck the University of Alabama at Jacksonville straight on. And there's a significant physical infrastructure damage and injuries on the campus. And I was looking at messaging that the campus emergency management director was putting out, asking for able-bodied volunteers to come and support emergency operations. So there's definitely a need for not only education in emergency management, but for universities to have their own emergency management programs. And I know UCCS does have that. We used to work very closely with Tim Steckline when he was the emergency manager here, and he's moved on to Kansas, and we still track Timmy's tornadoes, and we love Timmy, and I look forward to meeting the new emergency manager. My name is Steve Kerr, K-U-H-R. Not the basketball player from Indiana. That's not asked frequently. You couldn't tell by looking at me that I'm not that tall basketball player. I'm in kind of a unique position as an emergency manager, as a professional emergency manager. I'm the head of emergency management for Colorado Springs Utilities, and I am tasked and honored to lead a team of highly professional, highly skilled emergency managers that do a special job. They all have varying experiences, that working either in the community or in corporations doing emergency management or business continuity or something security or something safety, something to that effect. But what we do is when I say we keep the lights on for you, that really is just really a short snapshot of what we do. What Colorado Springs Utility does, what any utility does, provides a lifeline infrastructure that allows you to live the modern life that you live. Flip the switch, the lights go on. Flush the toilet, and poo goes away. You have, You need to make coffee, which is, by the way, water is the most important utility because without it you can't make coffee, right? That's what you learn. So, turn the tap on. And in order to do all those things, I provide gas, so you got to heat the coffee too, right? So provide gas. So we provide gas, water, electric, and wastewater. We're unique in that we're the nation's third largest public utility, and that makes us kind of unique. And in order to do that, we have to understand the technical aspects, the engineering aspects of the system. And my team works with their partners on the engineering and operations side to just make sure that the water flows and that the gas flows and let it stay on. And we also support the community. Colorado Springs Utility is part of the fabric of this community. It's one of the beauties of this community. It's sort of like the little big town, I call it. And we have a wildfire team. Our team is involved aggressively with the Colorado Springs Fire Department. Great partners. Chief DeBay is in the audience. The county wildfire team. We supported the Carson Midway fire over the weekend. We also had infrastructure that was potentially impacted, and there's a wildfire going on right now on Woodman and Falcon area, with our infrastructure potentially being impacted. So we're not only supporting the fire, but we're assessing what the potential impact could be. My background real quick, because it's like, well, what's the utility guy doing here? Well, I've done community and state emergency management. I have an undergraduate degree in emergency management administration and a master's in homeland security management. I did emergency management in New York City in the 1990s. I was deputy director there, and I did state emergency management for a short bit of time in New York State as well. So I look forward to having chatting with you and having to be here. Thank you.
So good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Boley. So currently I'm serving as the South Central Regional Field Manager. What does that mean? I work for the Office of Emergency Management for the state, basically, and I am the liaison to the same region that Doug was describing earlier, the 5 counties in the city of Colorado Springs. I also currently am kind of covering down for Douglas and Elbert County. So as you well know, it's going to be a busy summer here for a lot of us here. As Steve mentioned, we've been pretty busy over the weekend with the fire down in the Hanover area, the Midway fire. And that had some great complexities and some things that we'll be able to talk about here in a little while. As far as NGO engagement, it's been a long time since I've been able to do that, at least an hour now. We've got a lot going on in this region, and a lot of great partners that are coming to the table and stepping up to help other folks. And that's greatly appreciated, because our emergency management folks are few. There's not a lot of folks. We can't do everything we would like to do for you. We have to reach out and with those partnerships and find ways to make that happen. I've been around Colorado Springs now for probably about the last 8 years in emergency management roles, several different ones from El Paso County Emergency Management. I worked with the Sheriff's Office, worked at Pikes Peak Community College. So I've got a lot of different perspectives and how we integrated with NGOs in different aspects of that are very different, especially for the role I'm in now, where I'm more providing technical assistance to our emergency managers that are out here working in the field. It's really their role that's making that linkage, but there's a lot of stuff we can do in the state and some bigger picture agencies that we can bring to the table as well. So thanks for having us, and I appreciate it.
Hello, my name is Joe Mahoney, and unlike some of these people who seem to have gotten into disaster management on purpose, which doesn't make sense to me at all. But I worked for Catholic Charities of New Orleans. I started there as a case manager in May of 2005. In August, Hurricane Katrina hit, and we all became disaster responders, like it or not. If the agency had a disaster plan, I never saw it. We had about 1,000 employees when that hit. My first job was case management at the airport, which was changing diapers and putting people on planes that we didn't know where the planes were going. After that, I started to open up community distribution points. They said, "Hey, Joe, there's new with these FEMA folks, and you want to go to that. You don't like FEMA, why am I going to that?" And I think I stayed mad at FEMA for about the first 2 minutes of that meeting. And then, when you're in a room with someone who's just so much smarter than you, you're like, wow. FEMA, in spite of initially dropping the ball there, they had so much more information, they had plans. So I started learning. And we put it together on the fly, figuring out as we went along. I did that for about 2 years when Catholic Charities USA, the national office, which is right outside of DC, called me up and said, you know disasters. I went, you're damn right I do. And they said, well, would you like to keep doing this? And I don't know why I said yes, but I said yes. And I did that for another 2 years with Catholic Charities USA. So every Catholic Charities agency is independent. And they range in size. The smallest one I worked with had a half of an employee. The largest one I worked with, Catholic Charities of Chicago, has several thousand employees and a $250 million budget. So when you talk about what their response is going to be in a disaster, it varies agency by agency. I would call up the agency and say, hey, you need some help, and if they wanted it, I would fly out for several weeks from the main office and start trying to put together a plan. The good thing is, because of the way that agencies are so different, I never came in with this is the right model. Because there's never a right model. I came in and said, okay, what do you do? The most important lesson I learned is learn who your friends are first, before the disaster hits. You know, if they couldn't introduce me to the United Way director and the Red Cross director, these folks need to be your best friends. So, but I'm happy to be here tonight and answer any questions, help in any way I can.
I'm Thomas Gonzalez. I'm the Executive Director for the American Red Cross of Southeastern Colorado, and some of you may know it as the Pikes Peak chapter, so we changed the name a few years ago. It's composed of 16 counties and over 800 volunteers. And of those 800 plus, we'll just round the number up to 805. About 200 of those are our military-based volunteers that work on the 5 different military bases providing support every day. Our story really isn't about me today. It's really about those volunteers and the great work that they've done. I've been part of the American Red Cross for 8 years, and what a journey it has been. I used to call our area a sleepy backwater of the American Red Cross because there's no hurricanes, and the wildfires happen in the woods, and the floods happen in the Midwest, and then next thing you know, we had our disasters here, and then our folks became very experienced, and now are called out on national deployments, including the hurricanes of 2017, the wildfires in California, and the shooting in Las Vegas, and I can go on, and but they're great people, and if I could do one thing here today, because we have some experts here that are far more knowledgeable than me, is just share some of the stories of the people that I get to work with and the volunteers that I consider my family.
Thank you, gentlemen. And what I'd like to do then, if you would, one of the things with universities is they concern themselves with understanding the field, understanding policy, understanding the relationships, understanding the processes, understanding the action that goes in place. So if each of you could address your view of the world of involving what NGOs are and how you involve them in your organizations from a policy perspective, or if you, in the past, if you've done that. So if we could start with the VOAD, the Volunteer Organizations Act in Disaster, and a little bit of description of that, please, and how its policy operates.
So, as Andy said, the acronym is Volunteer Organizations Act in Disasters. And I have to say, Andy is a founding father of the VOAD that I am the chair of. So I have to probably defer sometimes. He's got more historical knowledge than I do. But so basically, as he mentioned before, it rose from the Waldo Canyon fire. So after that fire happened, there were non-governmental organizations, charities that were helping to with the fire. And from that, there was a recovery group that was formed, and from that recovery group, they saw a need for a VOAD locally. So there had been a VOAD movement nationally, and then so the recovery group formed a a VOAD, which then set together a set of officers. And currently there's about 40 or so organizations that are part of the South Central Region VOAD. And so when the Black Forest Fire came upon us, then the VOAD was in place to help assist those folks with assistance. So basically we have a set of bylaws and we have quarterly meetings, and I have to agree with Joe. A lot of the VOAD is, I think, maintaining relationships and trust. And there's also a little bit of a good problem to have. There's a lot of agencies that want to support and do the same thing. And so sometimes there's a little bit of competition between the agencies of who can do what. I do look at that as a good problem to have to some extent. So,
Steve?
Thank you. Disasters really come down to the human factor for me. And everything else takes second fiddle to making sure that the people aspect is taken care of in a disaster. So all the programmatic emergency management stuff aside that I've been doing for almost 40 years, and all the FEMA this and that, it comes down to, for me, life safety, human services, and infrastructure restoration in that order if there's a disaster. So you notice the first two things on my punch list there are related to people, life safety. First thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that everyone is rescued. We're going to work with our partners in the fire departments and the police department. If you're on the Coast Guard, National Guard, whoever, we're going to make sure we rescue, we save lives, we preserve life. The second part there is absolutely where the NGOs and VOADs come in, because that's the human service aspect. And if you're familiar with emergency management, programmatically, that's Emergency Support Function 6 under the National Response Framework, of which most emergency management agencies adopt. And we can talk more about that or catch me inside after. That's what ESF 6 is, the human service component of disaster response. Government agencies that are responsible for emergency management, first of all, emergency management agencies have no resources. Emergency management agencies have the resources that you see sitting in front of you. And right here, 75% of the city of Colorado Springs emergency management offices in the room, Toby and Kevin. So, but my point is, while emergency management agencies have no resources, and and emergency managers are in charge of nothing, emergency managers absolutely coordinate and are responsible for everything. And there comes in the VOADs and the NGOs again. And that's where we have to have strong relationships with our partners in the VOADs, those faith-based organizations, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army. So in New York, past history, in New York, we had what we called a disaster complex. Two tropical weather systems struck New York State, and something that had never happened before. Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Lee, a week apart, traveled up New York State, didn't just dissipate when they hit the coast, and caused extensive and severe riverine flooding throughout the state. And FEMA merged those two disasters into a complex, and I was state coordinating officer for that. And we had human service needs throughout the state. So we worked with FEMA under the IA program, the Individual Assistance Program under the Stafford Act, to secure an $18 million grant for Catholic Charities to do casework for us. And that's just one way how we use that. So all these individuals that were receiving individual assistance grants were receiving Small Business Administration loans, and were receiving various other programmatic support under the FEMA Individual Assistance Program. Now had cage workers to help them to move from mobile homes to apartments at homes, to help them with their food needs, to help them with their education needs. So that would be just sort of one example in my background. So we really cannot, as emergency managers, we can't do it without the NGOs. The NGOs really need to be prepared for this, the VOADs and the organizations. I don't expect that. So the American Red Cross, for example, in this region, has accepted responsibility for the distribution of bulk and mass bulk water in the event of water distribution, and a water distribution emergency. So I'm the emergency manager for a utility grant. So we have worked with the Red Cross to secure bulk water, bottled water, bulk water to distribute to the community if we have a disruption. I'm not even going to ask Tom if he's prepared to do that, because I know he is, because he's a professional. He knows that his job is to be prepared to meet those needs. So my point there is NGOs have to have an element of preparedness internally. They need to be able to sustain an emergency response, to do what they do best, and they need to be able to do with a modicum of continuity, so they don't fall out of the job. So
So Mark, you cover both an urban and a non-urban environment, and it's a multicultural. Can you talk a little about non-government organizations within throughout your area of responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely.
And at the policy level?
Absolutely. So when it comes down to disaster response, I mean, we all know that is a local governmental responsibility. And depending where you're at, that can be received very differently from the folks that are out there on the ground. Some of our more rural areas, there's a pretty good distrust of the government. I like to say a lot of times when I walk out there and I'm out in that community, a lot of people don't read past the top rocker that says Homeland Security and Emergency Management gets lost. So you have to understand the customer, if you will. And from a policy standpoint, that doesn't matter, right? We have the same responsibility to every citizen that's out there within the region. How we're going to go about doing that can sometimes require some critical problem solving and figure out how we're going to do that. How do we leverage the spheres of influence that are out in our communities? Because I might not be that person that folks are going to want to talk to, but somebody out there is. In a more urban setting, we'll do the same functions apply, and we'll set up. I'm going to use the Red Cross for an example. That we set up a shelter. In a Colorado Springs type environment, we're probably going to see a much lower turnout for what we would see out in like a Park County or a Teller County, who may not have nearly as many resources that they can lean back on. Whether that's just sheer infrastructure, not having the hotel rooms and those type of things, to their willingness that thought process of I'm going to take care of myself and I'm going to just stay with the neighbor. I'll use this weekend as a perfect example of that. Up in the Hanover area, we opened up a shelter. We evacuated about 350 homes, roughly, not an exact number. We estimated that's probably, take that times 3, 1,000 people, we'll call it. We had 7 stay the night. It's not like everybody else just went back to their homes that night, because that wasn't, those roads were locked down. So they were able to take care of themselves and see what that looked like. However, the next day when we got into the reentry phase of this, it was a very different story, and quite frankly, the Red Cross was a big help in stepping up to get that information to folks as they wanted to get back into their homes. But now there's a different need. It's what do I do about taking care of my home? Is it safe to go back in there? What do you need me to do? And then along with the governmental side, trying to establish some reentry, there's things that go with that, some dumpsters and things like that for food spoilage and some other things, making sure that we get the power back on. There's a lot of pieces that go to that when the governmental policy side of that reentry piece comes back to, they don't know they need that help, but it's happening. It's happening. We have to make sure that we are doing the right thing for those folks. Does that answer? Thank you.
Well, I think as you start talking to NGOs and realizing there's a different level of experience and professionalism at each and every one of them, even across Catholic Charities networks. You've got folks who've seen a lot of disasters, folks who haven't seen any. In Pueblo, which is where I run the Catholic Charities down there, we have case managers who deal with clients in poverty every day. They're experts at navigating systems. So when we talk about what our role in disaster response is going to be, everyone kind of knows. It's just like that. We got case management. If there's someone else who wants to do it, we're happy to welcome them to the table. One of the points I want to make if you're in a disaster is, I was working on my master's degree and had an instructor taught me this. She said, collaboration sucks. All right, so imagine that we're all in this room together and you're all running different nonprofits and we got to figure out how to coordinate the response. And by the way, maybe you just lost your house and 20 people are sitting out the front door saying, hey, how are you going to help me? And, hey, by the way, my power's out. Did I tell you what was going on? It'll make you crazy. That's why you need the BOAD. All right, it sucks, but it's the only way you're going to get through that disaster. And that's why the folks who've been through 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 tend to be the folks who can work well with other people. I think the most important aspect would probably be compassion. When you come into a disaster, you're dealing with the worst day in someone else's life. And you can't even begin to fathom how bad that day can be. Right? They are stressed, the tempers are going to flare. There's some pretty interesting studies about their psychological state. Immediately after disaster, people go into that Superman phase, where I can fix anything. These first 24 hours, I'm going to be on an adrenaline rush. I'm just going to work, and I'm going to get done. And nothing happens, and the rain keeps falling. Then they go into the depression. Oh man, this sucks, it's never going to be better. Nothing's going to be the same. At some point, and it may be weeks, it may be months after, they come to a new normal. Your job in disaster response, no matter what you're doing, I mean, the linemen, the FEMA, the Red Cross truck drivers, you're all going to be responding to people. And listening, that compassionate heart has to come first.
What would you like addressed?
What is the charter that the Red Cross has, and who has given you the charter?
Yeah. So the Red Cross is chartered by Congress. That's basically a business license to exist. And my background, I've had a career working with 2 organizations that have received a charter from Congress. The Boy Scouts of America for 18 years, who has a motto, "Be prepared," and the American Red Cross with a charter from Congress that says, "You better be prepared." So what we do is there's really 5 functions, and you ought to understand also that the nonprofits have more than just a disaster function to them. Joe alluded to the Catholic Charities social work aspect. For the Red Cross, biomedical is number 1, followed by disaster, which gets the headlines, and then number 2 or 3 is international services, and then our Service to Armed Forces program, which many of you have probably had an opportunity to take part of. And then finally, the 5th area is our trainings. We call them health and safety, and that's the CPR and first aid. But in regards to the disaster side, Congress asks us to help our communities through our donors to be prepared, to help with response, and then to help with recovery in terms of disaster. And so the question that I ask the audience here is, what do you think the number 1 disaster is that the American Red Cross responds to? And you know, yeah, no, you know, but anybody, take it. Yeah, house fires, yeah. That's our number 1 disaster, and just kind of keep that in mind when we're talking about these larger disasters, the wildfires and hurricanes and all that good stuff. But it's the house fires that keeps us the most busy in regards to preparedness, which Rebecca's part of, to the response, and then to the recovery phase. And I think really that helps us with our mindset and how we prepare for the larger disasters, because we follow the same 3 functions.
So I'm going to take this a little bit further now, and I want to ask, I see some NGO folks that I know, and they're in the audience, and I see some shirts. Anyone here from the Independent Center? So I'm going to tell you a little about the Independent Center. Thank you. So I'm going to share some things about Waldo Canyon. Let's talk about disasters where you have something, you have policies that are in place and relationships. And when there's no disaster, the interesting thing is that the NGOs are very tied up with the activities they get involved in. We talk about the Waldo Canyon fire, 32,000 people evacuated, just about everything west of I-25. What we don't remember is that there were multiple fires going on in the state of Colorado, and many organizations were being stretched very thin. So capabilities and overlap was necessary. So it was mentioned that I got involved in starting the Go-Ahead with Catholic Charities and several other nonprofits. I was actually volunteering for El Paso County and the city as the liaison and doing some ESF6 work, and sent over, and Patty Baxter, who's not here, I tried to get her to come with me so she could see some of her friends, but she's busy. And she was the emergency manager of the county at the time. She said, quick, get over to First Pres, there's something going on over there, I'm not sure what it is. And so we went into First Pres, went upstairs, big room there, and we had people from National Pres, First Pres, Lutheran Family Services, Catholic Charities. As I walked in, I saw Mark Molina, who was running Catholic Charities at the time, standing at the podium. Standing next to him was the head of the Buddhist Coalition from Colorado College. I looked over in the corner, and one of my students, who was with the Islamic Society of Colorado Springs, was making a cash donation to the Salvation Army on the spot. And I looked in the middle of the room, and from my former company, was my banker sitting in the middle of the room. And I looked right in front row of the Mennonites. We had the Baptists who do a lot of sifting through the fires and that sort of thing. And they were all fired up and ready to go. They were charging out the door. I mean, they were just, they had, we had a fire and their hair was on fire. They were ready to get involved with this activity. They had, their energy was up. They wanted the resources. The Seventh-day Adventists were there also. The problem was, and they're experts at getting supplies and warehousing those supplies and making sure that we manage those. People want to give away stuff. They like to give away a lot of water. And we've actually had people who have built walls with the water because there was so much of it, because they were just needed something to be occupied. So there's also a management, not only management of assets. GOAD consists of those organizations now, and it's actually an organization of organizations. It has no tasking authority. It is a coordinating and a collaborative effort in terms of doing that. So I looked in the middle, and there was my banker, and I said, John, what are you doing here? I said, you're the only businessman here. And he said, well, my pastor told me this was going to be going on over here, and I wanted to see what was going on. I came here and I finally found God's church. They all came together for a cause. And so out of that was the issue of how do we manage that type of activity, because I knew my banker. First time I met Mark Rolina, I didn't know anyone else, and I've been asked at that time to try to get involved with trying to help organize this. We wanted Seventh-day Adventists to help us with an awful lot of supplies that were coming in. The only warehouse at the time was Goodwill. And I don't know if Toby remembers this in the hot wash, but the quote from Goodwill said, as we did the hot wash after the event, said, we're not a disaster relief NGO, but we are now. So in terms of that, so you do get those organizations that come in, but it affects policy and it affects relationships. So I share that story so that a couple of you, I'm going to ask you to do that have been involved in disasters. Steve, I think you've had similar experiences when you worked with the unaffiliated. Can you talk about what the unaffiliated NGO is?
The unaffiliated NGO are these organizations that sort of pop up overnight. They're sort of like ad hoc organizations. I think the most recent, best example of that is this organization in the Houston hurricane called the Cajun Navy. Funny name, but they found the ability to coordinate using an app on the phones. It's a walkie-talkie app. And the Cajun Navy was an unaffiliated, unofficial NGO. It was men and women from across the southeast United States that came together that had maritime resources, boats and rescue equipment, and they were able to step in where the Coast Guard, National Guard, and other rescue agencies were just overwhelmed. The issue with that, and it's not necessarily a negative, it's just something that we as the professional emergency managers need to work on, is to make sure that all this is coordinated. Because if the Cajun Navy, for example, is making rescues in one quadrant, and we're planning to send out a Coast Guard helicopter or a National Guard helicopter to do the same thing, well, then we might be able to better repurpose those resources elsewhere. So it really has to be a coordinated effort. And that's not easy to do when you have these unofficial organizations involved. And it's really incumbent upon us to try to work through with our BOAD leads to try to get these unaffiliated organizations to cooperate.
Mark?
I'd like to add
Go
to
ahead.
that. So there's a term, it's called spontaneous unaffiliated volunteers. So it's basically what Steve mentioned, but and it's all called so-called convergence, because when disasters happen, people want to help. And sometimes it's just hard to stop people, but I strongly agree with what Steve said as far as affiliating volunteers so that we know that they're safe, and that they're safe people, and the children are protected, and things can be coordinated. The VOAD has 4 C's: communicate, cooperate, collaborate, and coordinate, communicate, cooperate, collaborate. Yeah, thank you. So, and I think it's important to try to get unaffiliated volunteers somehow connected in the state of Colorado. We have something called Help Colorado Now, which is a place where people can go to a website and register. And if anything, at least if you can register, you feel like you're helping. So there's people want to donate stuff. It gets to be too much stuff. It can't be managed. A lot of times money is what's more important to help the local community recover and get the supplies needed instead of just a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of good, I think, that we're able to do along those lines.
Yeah, well, Doug kind of stole my thunder there a little bit. I was going to kind of talk there a little bit about those unaffiliated volunteers. But one thing I want to kind of bring up as well is a lot of times you'll see private organizations, you know, folks that just want to come and help. What can I do? I can bring a resource. Another example, just this, what we got going on right now, there's a tire fire that's burning out in the Hanover area as a result of a wildfire burned over a gentleman's fence that he had built with tire bundles. Well, there's a heavy equipment operator that lives out in the area, Mr. Dwyer. I'll tell you, we were looking at, okay, we're going to bring in EPA and we're going to do some work out here. We're going to have to, figure out what we're going to do. We're going to have to get the trench built and this, that, and the other thing. We came out the next morning and overnight he had made that happen. I mean, it was done, and way better than we probably could have done it with just, who knows who on a dozer. I mean, he had a professional company there that was able to knock that out in probably a third of the time. Again, goes back to what Steve and Doug were saying about that coordinated effort. It can be difficult, but I think we have to just recognize that those volunteers are going to come. So if we don't do a little bit of prior planning for that, and kind of be ready to accept that and put them somewhere, link them up somehow with an organization that's going to be able to help. Last thing you want to do is just tell people no, right? It's just, it doesn't go over well and it's not good press. But again, you can't just cut them loose and not pay attention either, because that's just asking to get somebody hurt and causing your incident to grow around you. So a good management plan for that up front is important.
Yeah, I was wincing because I'm that responder who doesn't want to be around volunteers. When these spontaneous volunteers show up, just stay away from me. All right? The best agency, the agency I love and will always send a donation to, is the agency that agrees to manage that. Because people will come in, I'm here and I want to help. I've already got work to do and I'm overwhelmed. I don't have time to train you. So one of the lessons to take home tonight, don't be a spontaneous volunteer, be a skilled volunteer. All right? Sign up for Red Cross training or take the FEMA courses or get involved with an agency before the disaster happens. All right? Those skills are just crucial to have before the disaster. If you show up during the disaster, again, if there's an agency that can have you, because we do need it. And, God forbid with the attitude I have, and that's one of my problems, that I would have ignored the Cajun Navy. Or this guy who comes in and says, I've got bulldozers. You need those kind of people. You better be able to sift through, but you're going to have 1,000 volunteers, of which 10 are going to have the skills you want or need. One of the best volunteers I got to work with, in New Orleans, we had a problem with the levees topping over. It was levees all along the river as well. And at one point, one of the levees was starting to leak a little bit, and the ground looked kind of shaky. And some guy comes up and says, I'll take care of that. What are you going to do? He says, I'm going to take care of that. All right, how? Well, I got a bulldozer, and I'm going to use that bulldozer to see some rocks over there. And the rocks were part of someone's house, the driveway. He said, well, I'm going to steal those rocks and I'm going to put them on the levee. Well, you can't do that. If you damage that house or something, there's all these liabilities. He says, Oh, don't worry about it, sir. I'll put the rocks back when we're done. You know, at that point, you're a better man than I am. You go to it. I didn't hear a word you said. Just go get it done. So you do have to let those things happen. You have to be open to them. But please, you know, you're all in this meeting and you're all probably going to school or you have some sort of experience. Don't be a spontaneous volunteer. Be a skilled volunteer. And Red Cross is a good place to start with those skills.
All right, thank you, Joe. And so we call spontaneous volunteers event-based volunteers. And with our experience with the hurricanes of last August and September, what we would do across the nation for the American Red Cross is accept those event-based volunteers, but you have to do one thing. You have to go to redcross.org and you have to begin your process of filling out your application and most importantly doing your background check. Because you need to pass a criminal background check in order to have access to those shelters, because our number one focus is on the safety of our clients, the people that are staying in those shelters, those individuals and families. So we would get phone calls, we would have people show up. This was during Waldo Canyon, this is during Black Forest wildfire floods, the hurricanes, all that activity of last fall, and they all had to begin with that processing. Now, the Red Cross had streamlined that for this past fall, where it was specific to if you want to participate and support the hurricane relief efforts, there was a specific button on the website that you would click on that, and that way you knew that you were, and the Red Cross knew that you were going to be applying for that. An example of event-based volunteers from southern Colorado that participated in hurricanes were two nurses from Trinidad. And they had saw what was going on TV. They may have saw one of our Red Cross spokespersons locally speaking, and they said, we need to do something. And now that was a skill set, and is a skill set that is greatly needed, especially when you have a shelter of 10,000 people in Houston. And so we were able to fast track them through that processing because of the skill set that was needed by the American Red Cross at that time. The other thing I want to mention in regards to event-based volunteers is, I'll just share one story with you. During Waldo Canyon, I remember it was like, after it exploded, it was like 24 hours later, and I look out my office window, and all of a sudden I see all these Navy guys, and they're all wearing their Navy t-shirts. I'm like, I'm used to the Army and used to the Air Force. Where did the Navy come from? And but they were lining up to volunteer, and so we had to manage that. And they were ready to go. They wanted something to do, and we had individuals come in. We had groups to come in, and we tried to work with all of them. And some of them can work in our office, but if they're going to go into those shelters and support the shelter operations, then they need to go through that online background check. The other thing is, in regards to volunteers, is the corporate volunteers. And during the Waldo Canyon and Black Forest wildfire, we did have them trained up ahead of time. Were employees of Wells Fargo. And so they came in like as a reserve unit about 36 hours to 48 hours later. And then they supported a shelter. It was the Southeast YMCA shelter for Waldo Canyon. And then during the Black Forest wildfire, we brought them in. And they helped actually set up our headquarters. And when we have these large disasters in our area, our office can't handle the amount of traffic. It physically begins to fall apart. And so we set up a temporary headquarters and elsewhere where tractor trailers could come in with supplies and hundreds of people could move in and out. But in regards to event-based volunteers, we push them towards that online registration process. We look at the skill sets that they can have. It also gives them a chance to stop and realize, what am I putting myself into? But it also gives us a chance to evaluate a little slower what their skill set is, and if that's a needed skill set for the Red Cross operations.
So I'm going to touch on two areas now in terms of policy. One of the things that you're thinking about, here's those folks that are rolling in, and let's assume it's your house, and you don't know when you want to walk in. Think about that. And the other thing is, think about our vulnerable population within our community and how quickly they can be at risk. And what does that vulnerable population consist of? And I'll give you an example. This is my impression, my lesson learned, and it's my observation from where I sit. There's a wonderful organization up Woodman Road, St. Francis, which is a group of nuns that have a nursing home, and they take care of Alzheimer's patients, and they also were at that time accumulating nuns from all over the world whose cloisters were collapsing, and they were bringing in, and they were there. Well, that happens to be where the fire was. My house is up there and had $17,000 worth of damage. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face because of the orange smoke that was there. And there is something that we refer to as NGOs are not all faith-based. There are group of folks that I see Rubicons in the room and other that you might want to talk about. But in terms of policy, all of a sudden the PBOs, our ambulance company and our buses were used to go in towards the fire to rescue those people and get them back to Penrose Hospital and to other hospitals and get them out, as they did for other organizations, because the planning had not been in place for that effort. There was a young woman in the room who worked with those organizations later to help them from lessons learned that they had about how to have an emergency response plan so that they could become a little more successful should something else happen. But there's a consequence there, and when you do that, what happens when you take the buses and you move them up towards the fire? And you're sitting downtown on Pikes Peak in Nevada at the bus station, and that's your only transportation. And your medication is at your house, and the bus is rescuing someone else. We are short of resources. I mentioned the Seventh-day Adventists and how great they were in terms of the capacity that they had to take in donations and manage donations. The best person who was doing that had been captured by Northern Colorado, and that's how we got involved with Goodwill. Goodwill has a business model that was not understood by many of our donors in terms of how they did this for accounting. And there was tribal folklore that was put out, them being involved in this, and that they were trying to make money off of it because Goodwill does have employees, and they were accounting for every donation item using script, using a chip. It's their accounting system. But there was a lot of misunderstanding that went on there. I suspect you gentlemen have run into that from a policy standpoint where you said, hey, we've had a policy in place in terms of who would be able to do something, and all of a sudden you can't execute that policy. So has there ever been a time that you have had in disasters where you've had to execute and understand that policy is a little bit rigid and needed to be adjusted? Are you willing to share it? They're government guys, it's hard to do, you know. And now I want to open this up to the audience here so you can ask a few questions. I hope we've got your juices flowing a little bit.
Maybe not necessarily directly related to NGOs, but from a policy perspective, when we were doing planning for public health emergencies and biological terrorism incidents in New York City, we had identified 350 locations across the city that would serve as a point of distribution for the distribution of antibiotics. And we just, or antiviral medications. We just assumed, being emergency managers and not health policy people, that we could use doctors and nurses and EMTs and paramedics. Well, the health department stepped in and said, absolutely not. Everybody needs to be trained. They need to know how to dispense a medication, because you are actually dispensing a medication, or if somebody has an allergy. So we had to adjust course there, and we had to figure out how we were going to do that. And that really changed the model for how we were going to distribute these medications. I think the parallel there would be the same thing for volunteers serving in the NGOs. They're expected to do a specific task, and these individuals don't have that skill. I'll come back to the Cajun Navy. These guys apparently had these skills. They all came with boats, they all came with rafts and stuff like that, but maybe some of the boats were with them that just didn't, and they were just along, and somebody got sick on a boat or something, and they would have to navigate their way through debris-filled streets. I think that would certainly require some training. Maybe not a great parallel, but something to think about.
Anyone else?
Yes, and I think something else from the governmental perspective is we got to be careful where we go with when we start to talk about adjusting policy. But I think one of those places that we could see something like that happen are when we, and not necessarily with NGOs, but we see it a lot when we send responders across county lines where we send responders across state lines or bring them in to help us. I imagine that a lot of that same, those same certification issues are probably out there with folks like Medical Reserve Corps, where we're bringing people in to help supplement an incident that would be happening locally. So there are some things that have to be addressed there, and a lot of that can be done through, just by using governor's executive orders and things like that. We do have mechanisms in place that we can address some of those to a point. Like I said, we can bend the rules as far as we can, but you absolutely have to be careful that you're still meeting the intent of the law.
So questions from the audience. We've been talking about here, and you may have thoughts or ideas that you want to bring up, and I would like to hear from them.
Sorry.
Thank you. I was going to pick on Kathy back there, but thanks for that.
My name's Elaine. I'm curious, how do you collect, share, and act on lessons learned after the disaster is over, both in your own organization and across the lines to other NGOs that you might work with?
So in emergency management, there are some fairly standard processes across the board to review incidents. So during almost inevitably after every incident, certainly after every major incident, we conduct what's called an after-action review meeting. And it's a fairly well-structured endeavor where we come in with a set of objectives and a set of questions, and we review the incident sort of soup to nuts. We'll break it up into multiple meetings if you have to. For example, if we're going to review the response to a flood disaster, we may have one meeting just to discuss warning and alerting. Did we alert the community good enough? Because we could spend hours just talking about messaging. And why was the message messed up? And why did Boulder County say this, and Denver said this, and Colorado Springs, no thousands of that. So like that. Human resource part of a disaster deserves great attention. And from a VOLAD NGO perspective, we want to make sure we give that proper respect. And we will spend hours delving into those things. Then the after-action report is produced, and typically what we will do is we will revise emergency plans that relate to the response and test those plans in exercises and drills, update the plan again with the lessons learned in that plan, in that exercise, and hopefully never have to use that plan again. But inevitably, that's not really the case. So that's a fairly standard way we review things. And the after-action report is then disseminated. I'm all about transparency and openness, and that's not always the case because, again, I'm in a unique environment. I work in a semi-governmental organization, but my boss does not directly report to the mayor. Emergency management directors that typically report to mayors or governors are typically at will, and there's sometimes political objectives that come in place, and that just means not all the bad things can be reported in an after-action report. So you got to do some background reporting. This is the reality.
Thank you. That was a good question. So is there another hand back there? Thank you.
I have two questions. My first question is with these different organizations and groups, I've noticed that the challenge is with people with disabilities, like Catholic Charities, Red Cross. But as a person with a disability, there's no involvement there before the disaster happens. There might be some after, because I'm an expert myself in my disability. I have that to contribute to other people. So it seems that there's a creation of a lot of barriers when individuals with disabilities are not allowed to be in these organizations or invited to be in these organizations, in training, in communication access. There's a bevy of issues there. So I'm just wondering why that is not the case, or why that is the case, they're not involved. My second question has to do with communication and different avenues of communication. There is, on a whole, a lack of communication with these different organizations. For example, sign language interpreting on screen, captioning on screen, visual access to what's going on. There's different ways, but it seems that the only communication is auditory or captioned, but that doesn't meet the cultural needs of our community. And so communication challenges are evident.
I'll go ahead and take on the first part of that. So I agree, that is an identified shortcoming that we've had in the past. And I think there's a lot of effort that has been placed at that over the last several years, especially even here, right here in Colorado Springs area with the Independence Center. I know that there has been an Access and Functional Needs Committee that has been stood up, and that our offices of emergency management from both the county and the city here in the local area are engaged pretty heavily with that. I try to get in there at least a couple times a year myself to try to bridge that gap with our state Office of Emergency Management as well. In a bigger picture there, I know the Red Cross has sponsored a few meetings that we've come together to have conversations on this exact same topic. How do we get better inclusion? And I think we're starting to see a trend towards our offices of emergency management when they're not only just planning and looking forward at what that might look like, but also in our exercises and drills that inclusion is absolutely taking place now. Can it improve? Absolutely. Will we? Yes. Everything is an evolution, and I think we will be better.
Are you including mobility with that also?
Yeah, I believe that is probably the case. Mobility is a little bit more difficult when you're talking about a tabletop exercise or something like that. Those discussions are happening. So a perfect example today, there was an exercise happening that those discussions were there. I know that the Independence Center was actually included in that exercise today, and they were down there with the Healthcare Coalition. So another example that those discussions are taking place.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, I think, as a representative of the emergency management community, I think a mea culpa is in order, because we are not doing a good job communicating with the hearing impaired and the sight impaired. I just think we're not, and I think we need to do a better job at it. I've made it a mission of my team this year, and two of them are, one just left, but one of them may be audience, that looking at all the communication failures that we've seen in the emergency management community in the past few weeks even, starting with the erroneous Hawaii missile alert, then the erroneous tsunami alert on the East Coast that AccuWeather put out, to failures of the emergency managers in Sonoma County, California to order evacuations where people were killed, to looking at studying the social aspect of how people respond to warnings and emergency alerts. We're making improvements to communications. What does the utility need to do that? Well, quite frankly, my organization owns and operates 22 high hazard dams where any loss of life during a dam breach would be catastrophic for us. So we pay very close attention. Plus, we have a workforce. I care as an emergency manager for my workforce, just like Kevin and we care for their community emergency managers, enterprise emergency managers. If we have an active shooter in a facility, I got to get people to run, hide, fight, lock down, shelter in place, what it is, and I got to get that message. The emergency management community does not do a great job communicating with those with impairments, and we need to do a better job.
Other questions?
So I would like to add at Catholic Charities, we do welcome folks with hearing impairment. So we have volunteers currently in place that are volunteering that are deaf, associated with the Colorado Deaf and Blind School. So we are a welcoming place for volunteering there. Once it.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Kathy Simmons, and I'm the director of the MPA program here at UCCS. And we have a fantastic certificate program in emergency management and homeland security. And my question to all of the panelists is, what can we do here in our program to better educate our students? What is it that you're looking for in our students, and what can we do to better partner with y'all and to better serve the emergency management community?
Let me take a stab at that one and tell you about the experience that we had this past weekend with the Midway Fire. I would look at opportunities for service learning. And so from Pikes Peak Community College, we did have 5 students from their criminal justice system who went in as event-based volunteers. And they went through the background check. Now, what they supported us with is helping with bulk distribution this weekend as the residents returned. But they came to us on a Saturday. We got them sped up. Now, they weren't shelter managers. They weren't our RNs. They weren't those key components, but they got to have an active participation in the program. I would look at having some sort of involvement with an organization. That would include the training beforehand. And maybe they don't have the chance to see a disaster, and that's good. But at least they'll have that training beforehand.
I think you're doing it right now. I think having us here and starting a conversation. Let's talk. And it may not be, I think we just think about disasters, our focus is too narrow. You know, in my mind, poverty is a disaster that happens every day. So what skills are you giving your students that could help with our day-to-day operations? And you know, what can we do to help you all?
Yeah, a couple things, I just kind of jotted down here. One thing I think is internships. We talked about that a little bit here, but how do we get that experience base to go along with that education? That can be tough, especially for somebody that's trying to break into a field that is still fairly narrow. Widening constantly, where we were 10 years ago is not where we are today. It's much better, and our field's growing tremendously. But making sure that those folks can get out there and touch those emergency management professionals, prior to putting that first resume out there and looking for that job. I just kind of jotted a note, folks versus experience, if you will. This is part of that. Bringing in industry professionals to have those conversations, I think, is very, very important. Getting that perspective from folks that are actually doing the work. There is always the book answer, and then, I like to say there's the black and the white, but we live in the gray. So what does that look like to most of us up here? And currency. I'll tell you, when I went through my master's program, even some of the materials and things that were used were just not current and up to date with the field. And that's a challenge because it is a fast-moving, fast-paced, and very, very fast-developing profession right now. But trying to maintain that currency and what is important today in emergency management.
I have 2 philosophical-based degrees at the undergraduate and graduate level in emergency management and homeland security, and that's all well and good. And we need more of a bridge that closes that gap between academia and practitioner emergency managers. However, that said, we also need to have, and perhaps at the certificate level is the place to do this, we need to have practical-based education. And the way to do that is to get what I call boots on the ground experience, and that's the internships that Mark and others have spoken about. They need to know what it's like to stand watching an EOC for 30 hours without sleep, because I'm pretty sure we've all done that. And they need to know what it is to eat the New York City Department of Correction food at 4 o'clock in the morning, because that's who's providing food. Hopefully yours will matter. But they need to understand what it's like to go out and do preliminary damage assessments during a flood disaster with FEMA, both in the community or, in my case, around our infrastructure, to see what to try to meet those disaster thresholds so we can get a presidential disaster declaration. So I think practical education as opposed to philosophical education and boots on the ground experience. And I would also encourage the university, if I may be so bold, is to consider offering a straight up degree, both at the undergrad and perhaps even at the graduate level, specifically in emergency management. As Mark said, it is a growing field. There are people that are starving for those degrees, online, in classroom, blended, maybe combination. I think there's a market for that, but I also know that as a hiring manager, I'm looking for that degree. And if you could come up with a practical degree in emergency management, I just hired one of your students, as you know, and he's in the room. Bill Murphy came to us as an intern, and he's now a full-time emergency management specialist on my team.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. You produce candidates, I might be able to hire them, or Kevin might be able to hire them.
So, I'm Ted Thompson. I work over in North Common with J3 with operations. I've done a lot of disasters, big DOD and big FEMA. So one of our learned facts, every time we go into something is, when we're at phase 0, today, everything going pretty good. As soon as something happens, the information management, the knowledge management, the information overload it's a limit factor for us. So just out of curiosity, do you have a single source of information, input, output that you're looking at? Do you have a single place where your folks go to upload information for resources, capabilities, shortfalls, to push requests to higher level, to the DCO, DCEs, or the state coordinators or something like that? If you could talk to that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So yes, there are systems in place, and no, they are not common necessarily everywhere you go. I'll say that up front. What the state uses is WebEOC. So we do a lot of our information management through there, whether it be situational reporting, resource ordering, all of that is managed there. The entire state has access to that, and I will tell you that any resources that need to be ordered that are going to come from the state, which is a big part of my job, is to liaison with that, will be done in WebEOC. How local resources are ordered, that is not necessarily always the case. The city of Colorado Springs uses WebEOC. It has a very robust system built there, and that works very well. We can still see challenges with trying to bridge some of those systems sometimes. It's not as clean as we would like it to be. Other places use systems like Trello and a card-based system that is something similar to what we used to use as T-cards for those that have been around a little while, and still use them when we need to. But it's basically a card-based system that moves through. It's just another application. When it really comes down to it, it's the stubby pencil work that we forget how to do sometimes, right? We get so reliant on our technological systems. Now, I'm not a guy that says, let's go back to the pen and paper, because I absolutely encourage use of systems like WebEOC, whatever that may be. Where we will see challenges with that is with DoD partnerships sometimes. We'll be honest, sometimes it's firewall issues that we have trouble getting through with communications. What we do is work around them. We find those ways. Those emergency managers get in the room. Here locally, we have the civil-military collaborative that gets together pretty regularly, and we talk about those issues where we can get those emergency managers from USAFA, from the academy, or from Fort Carson in the room and figure out what systems they use, and are there ways we can work around that on the periphery to make those, to gain those common operating pictures and information management that you're talking about.
What we need in the emergency management community is, and WebEOC tries to be this, it's not mature enough to do this though. We need a common operating picture, or we need a dashboard, so we could all see what is going on. Maybe that incorporates GIS, and I just think the systems that we have right now are clunky. In this day and age of advanced communications, you wouldn't think that that's the case. My team is trained to use basic elements of intelligence to develop situational awareness reports. We collect information, we synthesize the information, we analyze the information, we collate the information, we distribute the information to specific customers. Anybody in the room that's from the military recognizes that as how intelligence is gathered. Situational awareness is intelligence. So I love doing this, and I'm going to ask this. Whenever I have an opportunity, I ask, what federal agency does, what federal agency does the emergency management community get their most actionable intelligence from? Anyone, call it out. Thank you, sir, you called it. And you may be the first person that's ever got that right.
Wait a minute, he's an emergency manager.
There you go. And that's absolutely correct, because I can tell you, I hold a top secret security clearance from the FBI. I go to classified briefings. I've been reading intelligence reports for years, and I have infrequently, if not ever, seen something truly actionable that we could respond to. However, almost every day, the National Weather Service gives me actionable intelligence.
A red flag warning is extremely actionable, especially today. They don't do blizzard warnings anymore, but a winter storm warning with blizzard conditions to a utility emergency manager, huge. And we get that information. And we can not only read their reports, we can call in and discuss with them. The National Weather Service is friendly, and they want you to call, especially when they're going through what they're going through now with potential budget cuts. But that notwithstanding, they're very easy to work with. So we collect information on the gathering storm using all those processes we just discussed, and we'll distribute that information to our internal customers. We typically share them with our county and city emergency managers. Kevin sees information pretty regularly that I push to him, but we don't have it on a common operating picture. I'm not seeing that the city's pushing out regularly. Kevin will call me, or Toby will call. I mean, the relationship is solid. Chief Dubé, we're working right now on a big project about solidifying how we respond to one of our properties south of the city. Great relationships. I wanted to say this in the beginning. As an emergency from the East Coast, it's knife in the neck emergency management. Everybody's got an agenda. Everybody wants to put a knife in their neck to get ahead. I loved coming here and finding that people actually coordinate with each other. The 4 Cs. That's why I said, hey, that's my 4 Cs. Everybody really does get along here, and we have professional emergency managers in this town. They make it work. And of course, I include our friends and colleagues in the fire service and EMS and law enforcement agencies. So it just really is that way. Sorry.
So I want to jump in that one also. We've had, and I apologize, Winston Churchill said to an American general when he said something rude to Winston Churchill about a plan, he said, that's terminological inexactitude. And we've allowed acronyms to be used here. So you mentioned the DCO, that's the Defense Coordinating Officer. And there's a major disconnect when it comes to state, local, and integration of DOD, Department of Defense. I'm a plant owner in North County. I still advise the J9, and I sat in on a meeting not too long ago. As a result of the experiences with needing high water vehicles, that one of the things they're looking at what they call playbooks, is they're looking at how to integrate a capability in tasking so that if we need high water vehicles, we're not just going to go out and find a bunch of rednecks with tall trucks. So in terms of doing that, how are we going to go, how do you take that? So there is an after action activity that takes place. In this room is one of the women who work very, very hard to work with nursing homes and medical organizations to get agreements in place as the experience came out of that. We call it gaps, fault lines, and seams. A gap is what we're looking for. People would think, oh, you're in trouble if you show the gap. In emergency management, you look for those so you can bring them together to build the seam. The fault line is understanding where those relationships are, like in tennis, where you align and you know where your ball is going to hit and stay in board. So they work those things through those after-action reports. So one of the things I would say is if you want to get involved. Also, what I didn't tell you is I just retired a year ago as the chancellor of Colorado Tech, and I helped run the Homeland Security program here. I was at UCCS and now we're at CTU, and Steve teaches at CTU in the emergency management area. And I want to answer the question about academics. I think that's very important in terms of, first thing is do a literature search. Eden knows what those are because it's painful in terms of doing that. And then I would benchmark against those other universities within the United States that are way ahead of you, that are doing that, because they're doing you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I do the literature search to build the documentation, I do the practical leadership as well as peer leadership. I sit on 2 journals with Steve and on peer-reviewed journals. If you're familiar with those, they're very painful to write for. But there's good documentation out there that your students can get into. And as you start to think about that curriculum, bring in subject matter experts. There are folks that are sitting at this table, like Toby, who's sitting there. By the way, there's a program called EMAP. Help me, what EMAP is? Emergency Management. Would you talk about EMAP a bit?
It's Emergency Management Accreditation Program.
And so universities can be EMAP'd also, as you can be, and the city is one of the top organizations, and Toby's an evaluator for EMAP, and she's been to California and Kansas and other places to do that. So you can get to understand that. One of the fault lines we have when we try, and is there employment out there? Did you know that USAA has an emergency manager in every one of its locations? Did you know that Jacobs Lab that just took over one of the biggest engineering firms has emergency managers all over the country? And they're very concerned about things such as pandemics. They were known as CH2M Hill when the big pandemic took place in China, and they had to stop work and they had to worry about how they're going to take care of their employees and manage that. So it's not all fancy, protecting from inside employees doing bad things or outside people coming in, but they have those, public school systems have emergency managers. So there are jobs there for folks that go into that particular arena. And in terms of management, there's a need for policy in that area. There's a need to understand folks who are going to understand what public administration is about and how you put that policy in place by knowing what the boots on the ground are. I'm a practitioner scholar, but I also think we need scholar practitioners who come from academia and then step into that arena, because they also need to get certifications. And you can get those through taking courses online with FEMA. There are FEMA courses that are available that you can map into it, and then you can put those, make polysyllabic words out of the simple things that they put there and make it academic if you like. So, other questions? Thank you, Kathy. I'm glad you said
You don't even know what I'm asking you.
And Kathy's with Team Rubicon.
Okay, yes, I'm with Team Rubicon. So you all made the point very, very correctly that emergency managers have a lot of responsibility and absolutely zero resources of your own. So you have to beg, borrow, steal, repurpose from all sorts of other sources, especially from NGOs. And you collect NGO connections like people collect baseball cards, right? The more you have, you win. What are your unmet needs that so far you don't have cards to cover? Where are your thin spots, either in your own experience or things you've seen in other jurisdictions, that an NGO might be able to help you with, or a new NGO needs to spring up to do?
Well, I'm in a little bit of a unique situation because my population is smaller than the community population. But we work with our friends in county and city government to prepare for a tragedy at the utility of confronting our workforce, such as an active shooter event. It's just reality. There was one today in Maryland. A school, a student shot 2 other students, and the student was confronted by, and was killed by a police officer who stopped the active shooter. So we have, and Bill Murphy on my team is lead on this, we have an employee family and assistance program. So as the emergency management organization for the utility, and certainly as a utility, we're very workforce friendly, but we're not very touchy-feely. We got guys hanging off buckets in the middle of the rain, and we got guys in valve houses turning big old valves and stuff. I mean, we're a utility. So we need our NGO partners to help us with should such a tragedy like that befall us. And those would be perhaps spiritual support, might be psychological counseling, CIT. Now, we have a program for that. We have an EAP program internally, but if we have an active shooter that was so large and it impacted families, and I went to a briefing a few weeks ago about the Pulse nightclub shooting. That was the LGBT club in Orlando, Florida, that where 49 people were killed. It was an FBI briefing. It was an enormous, wonderful briefing because there was good listeners going on. 49 families required spiritual support, counseling support. Chick-fil-A opened up on Sunday to feed these folks that were brought to community center. So we might, as a utility, looking at my workforce, those might be something that we could use.
I'll kind of tack into that one there as well. Some things we do very well and we've been doing for a long time. Feeding, sheltering, some of the more basic things that we see in water delivery in a response type environment. But as we move into recovery, in those longer term needs that we see with folks, some of the case management, mental health being one of those very important aspects that are out there. And what does that look longer term? Because after a week or so, let's face it, even most of our NGOs, they go home or they go to the next incident because it doesn't stop. There's always something else going on. I will tell you, what's the next level? And having that tiered approach that Doug talked about with the BOADs, can we always count on Red Cross to be there when we have 3 major storms on the East Coast and almost all of their folks are deployed out of here to go support other regions? Now what? You know, now something pops, we have a wildland fire here in Colorado. Now what are we looking at to have to backfill some of that support that we would typically fall on an NGO with another support mechanism? So that's there. And again, I think some of the long-term case management, what that looks like. You know, everybody, we can give some support for a little while, but that deeper fight, look at a month, 2 months, 3 months, 5 years down the road for some folks. You know, catastrophic loss of everything has a significant impact in a life for a long time.
I do think that's a good point as far as the disaster recovery. Catholic Charities, our focus has always been long-term recovery. So those first few weeks, we're not there. We focus, we want to come in for the long-term recovery, and that's going to be anywhere from 3 to 10 years.
Black Horse Recovery is still going on, and to this day, and it hasn't stopped because of regulations, because of federal regulations and state regulations. So one of those, I think we need a full deck, Kathy, not just one card for one player. The other thing is the robustness to be able to get involved with an NGO. NGOs aren't that robust until we're all interested when the crisis happens. When it's quiet and dull and we're sitting around the house with nothing else to do. We don't necessarily show up those meetings or get involved with that effort. The other thing I want to address here, for those who don't know, faith-based organizations who get involved in this and they join the VOAD, there's another rule in place is that they cannot proselytize. So it's not a place to come, but there are spiritual needs that are met, and it's a passive way that is approached. And we've actually seen, there's a famous case that took place during the tsunami in Japan, in which an individual who was very skilled, who was a Baptist, who was giving spiritual aid to a woman who was Buddhist. So in Japan, and that story is told by an individual from the Red Cross, who is one of the head chaplain for the Red Cross and also for the FBI. She was Japanese and went to Japan to help in there. So I think understanding how you can work across the aisle and being able to do that that card is needed also. That you've got to work together in terms of doing things. It was like Goodwill's supporting when we couldn't get the advocates in because they were locked up north, or you're looking at those capacities. Help, and then reach out to your emergency managers. They use language that's hard to understand. It's the acronyms and even across the country, the language, the lexicon can be a little bit different. So getting to understand that and keeping that ever-expanding vocabulary going and doing that's something that I think academia can bring to bear also, just understand how those are defined. Academia is very good at parsing the meaning of very complex phrases and policies that are in place. So that's another card that would be in place. So we're supposed to stop at 7, but I know that there are folks who don't want to ask questions from the seats, but they might want to address these individuals. And I'm going to stop right there unless there are any questions from the audience.
Hey, Andy, can I share one story? Go ahead. One story. This is on the faith-based part. So faith-based is an important part of reaching out for mental health and reassurance to people who are in a disaster situation. And so my experience with it was during Waldo Canyon wildfire, and had one of our Red Cross workers walk by my office and say, "Hey Tom, I just want to let you know the Catholic bishop called up and they wanted to come into the shelter," and I told them no, that we don't allow proselytizing. So within about 15 minutes or less, I get a phone call on my cell phone from Mark Rolina, the head of Catholic Charities in Colorado Springs at that time, and said, "Hey Tom, so-and-so Bishop Sheridan would like to come and visit the shelters." And 15 minutes later, we were in one of the shelters. And it was a very peaceful experience and reassuring experience for those people that had a chance to meet with the bishop at that time. But that's how I met this guy right here, Joe Mahoney. So I just wanted to pass that along.
It was a traumatic experience all the time.
Yeah. One other thing on evaluation, I didn't have a chance to say something about this. In regards to the evaluation for the American Red Cross, we approach it in several ways. One, we do have an evaluation meeting probably month, 2 months later. I don't remember the time frame on that. It's an all-day affair. It's somebody who was not with the Red Cross comes in and walks us through. It's very professional, very interesting. And so we go through that review, and then it's written up, and then it's shared. And you'll see your good, you'll see your bad. The other evaluation that's part of that task is a survey that's sent to the people that we work with, the government organizations and then the other non-government organizations, and they get a chance to weigh in on our response also. And then the final evaluation, and it's really not the final, it's just another evaluation, is each of our volunteers are evaluated by a supervisor that they work with during that deployment. And that also includes our professional staff. And so that goes into their personnel record, volunteer or professional staff, in regards to, is this person ready to handle disaster? Are they good for being deployed on another one? That's it in just a very brief nutshell on the evaluation.
Thank you.
The only other really quick point I want to make to answer your question, animal care. I don't think we do a good enough job in animal care. We have the Pikes Peak Humane Society. I'm not quite sure I'm getting the name right. I think they're excellent, but animal care is bigger than a single organization. Small animals, domestic animals, then agricultural animals, and then large animals out in the wild. Sometimes during a wildfire, they get pushed into a community. How do we deal with that?
That was a lesson learned out of Waldo and Black Forest, that Humane Society said, we're busy, we're trying to raise money, we're short of funds, and one of the other issues is money. This thing costs money. And cities and counties, they're short, and they're going to be in the hole for a long time when this happens. And so the CART, the County Animal Response Team, was started by the emergency manager and her daughter, who she rescues horses out east, and a couple of volunteer veterinarians. And the Humane Society said, oh yeah, we want to do that now. They took it over. And they're doing a bang-up job to make sure that they're taking care of big animals, large animals, whatever.